I hope everyone can hear me. Hello, everyone. Good morning, and welcome to the session Digital Dilemma AI Ethical Foresight versus Regulatory Roulette. My name is Tayyaba Iftikhar. I'm a digital policy and governance specialist, and this is a conversation that I've been looking forward for many weeks. Today is the final day of IGF 2025, and it's fitting that we're closing with one of the most important global governance challenges: how to regulate artificial intelligence in a way that's both ethical and enabling. Is that even possible? As the awareness of AI's power has risen, the dominant response has been to turn to AI ethics. Ethics, simply put, is a set of moral principles. We've seen governments, companies, and institutions roll out principles, guidelines, and frameworks meant to guide responsible AI development. But here is the problem. When ethics is treated as a surface level add on, it often lacks the teeth to create real accountability or change. And that's where regulation grounded in ethical foresight becomes essential. We'll be unpacking the challenge today through insights from multiple regions and perspectives. I'm joined in person by three incredible speakers: Yasmin Al-Duri, AI governance consultants, Deloitte; Alexandra Krastins, lawyer at VLK Advogados; and Fumzile Von Dam, integrity, tech ethics, and digital democracy consultant, who will be joining us in just a short while. We also have a vibrant virtual component. My colleagues, Mohammed Umair Ali and Harisa Shahid, are the online moderators. Umair, over to you to introduce yourselves and our online speakers.
Hello, everyone. Just mic testing. Am I audible?
Yes.
Great. So, welcome, everyone. Welcome to our session. I'm Muhammad Umair Ali. I'll be serving as the co-host and online moderator for this very session. Uh, Briefly about my introduction, I'm a graduate researcher in the field of AI and public policy. I'm also the co-founder and the coordinator for the Youth IGF Pakistan. And by my side is Harisa Shahid. Harisa, can you turn on your camera?
Hello everyone. Sorry, I can't turn on the camera right now, but hello from my side. I'm Harisa Shahid from Pakistan, and I am also the co-organizer for the Youth IGF. Along with that, I am serving as an information security engineer in the private firm in Pakistan, and I am also an ISOC RD career fellow this year. So looking forward to the session ahead. Thank you.
And moving towards the introduction of our speakers, so we are joined by speakers from the United Kingdom and Canada. To start with, Mr. Vance, who is the Senior Technology Policy Advisor for the Office of the Privacy Commissioner in Canada, and Mr. Moritz from the United Kingdom, who is the Chief of Staff at the Institute of AI and Law. Welcome aboard, everyone. Over to you, Taiba. Taiba, am I audible?
Thank you so much for letting me know. I'm going to repeat myself. We'll begin with a round of questions for each of our five speakers. One question each, about 5 minutes per speaker. Towards the end, we will be taking up pictures, speakers with the audience, so please don't run off too quickly at the end. Alexandra, I'll start with you. So many of the AI frameworks we see today cite ethics as a very important aspect. But when you look at it a bit closely, ethics often feels like an add-on rather than like a foundational principle. From your perspective, is that enough? And more importantly, what does it look like to truly embed ethical foresight into governance structures so that it shapes the direction of AI development from the very start?
Great, thanks. It's an honor to contribute to this important discussion. And while I have proudly funded a civil society organization called Laboratory of Public Policy and Internet, and served for a few years in the Brazilian Data Protection Authority, Today, I speak from the private sector perspective. I represent Felica Advogados, a Brazilian law firm where I provide legal counsel on data protection, AI, cybersecurity, and advising multinational companies, including big techs, on juridical matters and government affairs. And when we talk about embedding ethical foresight into AI governance, we're not talking about simply including a list of ethical principles in a regulation or policy document. We are talking about building a proactive and ongoing process, one that is operational, not theoretical. Ethical foresight means anticipating risks before harm occurs. So it requires mechanisms that allow organizations to ask the right questions before AI systems are deployed. Are these systems fair? Are they explainable? Do they reinforce historical discrimination? Are they safe across different contexts? And this ethical foresight must be built into organization governance structures, including AI ethics committees, impact assessments, internal accountability protocols that operate across the entire life cycle of AI systems. It also requires clarity about roles and responsibilities within organizations. Therefore, ethical foresight is not just the job of the legal or the compliance team. It needs engagement from product designers, data scientists, business leaders, and most importantly, it needs board level commitment. At the same time, foresight must be context aware. Many global frameworks are still shaped primarily by North countries' perspectives, with assumptions about infrastructure, economic and regulatory capacity, and also risk tolerance that do not necessarily reflect the realities of the global majority. So the regulatory debate should be connected to social context. In Brazil, for example, historical inequalities, specific challenges for entrepreneurship, and limited institutional enforcement power. Besides that, embedding ethical foresight in governance requires abstract principles. That is, by setting minimum requirements rather than imposing a one-size-fits-all model. And tools can be adapted to specific conditions, such as voluntary codes of conduct, soft law mechanisms, AI ethics boards, and flexible risk-based approaches. Additionally, national policies may have different strategic goals, such as technology development, maintaining geopolitical leadership, protecting ethical values. And some countries, for example, tend to emphasize ethical values, while others prioritize technological advancement. This regulatory asymmetry creates a highly concerning scenario of unaddressed ethical and social risks, international regulatory fragmentation, and direct normative conflicts. So, embedding AI foresight requires international coordination with minimum safeguards, promotion of technological progress, investment, and global competitiveness. So, considering this scenario, the proposal I bring for reflection today is the need to establish global AI governance platforms capable of harmonizing minimum principles on safety, ethics, and accountability while respecting local specificities. Besides that, incentivize tools such as voluntary codes of practice, which allow business to anticipate and mitigate risks without restricting innovation. And additionally, there should be perimeters for cross-border regulatory cooperation for enforcement and accountability, since jurisdictional fragmentation makes enforcement difficult, especially when platforms operate globally, but accountability is local. And in my experience advising companies, I've seen that while they are willing to act responsibly and ethically, international cooperation and legal certainty are essential for that to happen. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Alexandra. And as she mentioned, ethical foresight is not just the job of a legal team, but truly a multi stakeholder process. Now we'll turn to our online speaker, Moritz, if you're there. You've been keeping a very close view on how AI regulatory frameworks are evolving and also where they're falling short. From where you sit, from your perspective, what are some of the key loopholes or blind spots in current AI regulation, and what would it take in terms of practical terms to close these gaps and build a governance model that builds digital trust and resilience? Over to you.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for having me. People have often asked this question. So, what are the regulatory gaps that we see? And I think that assumption already is a bit flawed and mistaken, because that would assume that around these gaps, we have well thought out systems and processes and frameworks. And I don't think we have. And so I will employ a metaphor used by a former professor of mine who said that he does not have knowledge gaps because they'd be just too large. But he has knowledge islands, and those are surrounded by a lot of ocean that we don't know about. And then if those islands are well connected enough, then you can travel back and forth, and it still kind of works. But there are more gaps than there is actual substance. So with that caveat, let's look at where those gaps are clearest, or where the ocean is deepest, so to speak. And I think on the domestic level, I would identify two big items. One is a lack of technical expertise. And so regulators often lack the deep technical understanding that is needed to effectively oversee those rapidly evolving AI systems. That's especially true in countries that have historically not had the kind of capacity and resources to build up that infrastructure and those institutions. That then in turn creates a reliance on industry for setting standards, for self-reporting, for self-assessing the safety of their models. And that makes it very difficult to craft meaningful technical standards on the political level. That's one of these very deep sea areas. Another one is that we often see reactive frameworks. So current approaches largely respond to known harms and try to track when a harm occurs, but they do little in terms of anticipating emerging risks. And if you think that that is where a huge amount of the risk in the future is going to come from, then frameworks need to be adaptive to that. And the pace of AI development, which proceeds at a breakneck speed, consistently outstrips the pace at which regulatory systems can adapt, which is a huge challenge. On the international level, I think there's one big item that then feeds into other problems, which is jurisdictional conflicts or races to the bottom. And then that turns into sometimes unjustified, sometimes justified fears of overregulation. So different national approaches, but also international approaches like the one that the EU has taken, create a lot of complexity for compliance and regulation. And China's governance system, which focuses on algorithms, differs fundamentally from the EU, which is more risk-based. The US, the UK have emphasized innovation-friendly approaches, and that creates a regulatory patchwork that is difficult to navigate, but also creates room for regulatory arbitrage. So similar to how you would move your company to a country that has very low tax rates, you might do the same when it comes to regulation. And so that then creates incentives also for countries to water down and weaken their regulation. All of this is amplified by the fact that we just do not know enough. So a lot of the terms that are used in the concepts like risk, systemic risk, are insufficiently defined, and there's no consensus on what that actually means. So on that maybe a bit gloomy note, now we'll move on to what we can take to close these gaps, or rather to build bridges between those islands that we already have with the UAI Act and some other frameworks that exist around the globe. One thing is, I think we need adaptive regulatory architectures, which means that rather than having static rules, we need frameworks that can evolve with technology and rather quickly. And so that could mean that you have principle-based regulations. And then technical implementation standards can be updated through streamlined processes in secondary regulation. You could also have regulatory sandboxes where you try out new approaches and see what works, and have very quick feedback loops, which maybe governments aren't historically good at, but are definitely getting better at as we speak. There's a general need for capacity building. So I've talked about how expertise is lacking in governments often, but it's also lacking elsewhere. So creating independent technical advisory groups could be useful that include the perspectives of different people. And that also means that we need inclusive and novel approaches to engage stakeholders. We need dialogues and diplomatic efforts. So I've said that some terms are just not sufficiently defined. And so without a shared language, the landscape will remain fragmented, and incentives to cut corners will remain. So we see some work on this with international reports coming out and the international dialogues on AI safety, for instance, but much more of this is needed to establish consensus on the key questions, because only then can we start to think about regulatory frameworks. And one last thing, because I do work on AI, so I have to flag this. There might also be ways to leverage AI for these processes. And I think relatively little work has gone into this, and much more is needed. There are many more gaps and many more solutions that we could talk about, but I'll leave it at that for now, and I'm happy to receive questions about any or all of these in the Q&A.
Thank you, Moritz. I have a question. You mentioned shared language. Can you elaborate more on that? Because it sounded really interesting.
Yeah, so this runs the gamut. Well, it basically spans from the very fundamental, what is the risk? What is an AI system? Luckily, the OECD provides a definition that most people are happy with. But when it comes to, I'll give you a concrete example, the definition of systemic risks in the European Union under the AI Act. This will influence a lot on how future AI models are governed and deployed and developed. And so since that is the case, it really matters what people think of as systemic risk. And it's not a field that has centuries of research behind it, but rather decades. And so some people understand very different things under systemic risk as others do. And so unless you have some consensus on this, it'll be, very, very difficult. That's on the sort of fine-grained regulation and a specific legislative framework. But there's also high-level conversations about what are even the most important risks, and to try to create consensus on this. Again, different cultures, different countries see AI in a very different way. And if you consider that makes it difficult to cooperate and collaborate internationally. And so to establish a shared language around what does AI risk mean? And I'm specifically focused on risk here, but the same goes for benefits. What are the benefits that we care most about? That will be needed. And that again also touches on the technical expertise, because a lot of this requires a kind of technical knowledge, and you need to know what accountability is and what adversarial robustness is of an AI model. So that further complicates things.
Thank you so much, Moritz. Very enlightening. And the main key takeaway I could see was that different countries see AI in a very different way. And I think we really need to explore this further. Vance, I'm going to go to you now. Given how borderless technology is, there's a real challenge around jurisdiction and enforcement. And I know Moritz also touched upon it in a way that platforms operate globally, but the laws don't. What opportunities do you see for cross-border regulatory cooperation, and how can regulatory cooperation help tackle jurisdictional conflicts and enforcement barriers, especially for digital platforms that may be lightly regulated in one country, but highly impactful globally? Over to you, Vance.
Sure, thanks. So it's a very interesting question when we get into this idea of regulatory cooperation, because I mean, as Moritz has been flagging, not only are the understandings of artificial intelligence different across countries, there's such a difference on what regulatory frameworks actually exist and what can be applied, that once we're into the realm of enforcement, certainly there are some countries that have attempted to do uh, make shared enforcement efforts, but I don't think those are necessarily where we need to focus our efforts. They're not necessarily going to be the most effective way to address some of these issues. I think what really needs to be happening when we're talking about regulatory enforcement, rather than shared enforcement actions, it really has to be how can regulators have more influence over the design and development and deployment decisions that are being made when when these systems are being created or adopted in the first place. Um, and that's something that a lot of organizations are starting to try to wrap their heads around. I look at a document like the OECD has a framework for anticipatory governance and emerging technology. Emerging technology, anticipatory governance of emerging technologies. Um, I don't have any particular connection to it. The OPC, my organization, doesn't have it particularly endorsed this document, but it just kind of creates this useful framework for me of saying, the elements that they set out in this framework of what this regulatory governance needs to look like, saying, it need to establish guiding values, have strategic intelligence, that bring in stakeholder engagement, agile regulation, international cooperation. Um, Again, I don't want to walk through this framework in particular, but I do think there are useful pieces that come out of that. Because from a regulatory perspective, one of the challenges that we always face is that we don't really get to set the environment in which we work. Generally speaking, regulators are not going to be the ones who are drafting the laws that they're overseeing. We may be able to uh, we may be able to provide input into their drafting, but by and large, we're going to be handed a piece of legislation over which we have to have oversight. So um, uh, there are elements, but even within that though, there are elements of discretion as far as what kinds of resources can be applied, or what strategies can be applied to particular problems. Or there are often, in a lot of statutes, there will be considerations with respect to appropriateness or reasonableness. I think that's going to be a critical piece for AI governance, for particularly the challenge that you've set out. Um, this idea of international impacts of AI systems, where frankly, as a regulator in a Western nation, um, we aren't necessarily going to be able to have that direct visibility, that direct insight into um, the impacts of that system on, for instance, the global majority. So we aren't necessarily going to have, again, that full visibility into um, what uh, what safeguards we need to be pushing for, or what appropriate purposes or what reasonableness actually means in the context of these AI systems, when we aren't seeing what the true impacts of these systems are. So having those kind of dialogues amongst regulators, to share that cultural knowledge, that cultural knowledge, is going to be a critical piece of this going forward. Um, and just the sheer regulatory cooperation of understanding amongst regulators who has what capacities in AI, as Moritz flags. In a lot of for a lot of regulators, there isn't necessarily going to be that technical expertise, and that can be quite understandable. For a lot of newer data protection authorities, or some of the less resourced authorities, you might have a dozen staff for the entire for the entire regulatory agency. And that's not a dozen staff on AI. That's a dozen staff covering privacy or data protection as a whole. And obviously, data protection isn't the only piece of AI regulation. It's just kind of the piece I'm most familiar to. That's why I'm kind of focused on it. So, you might have a dozen staff. Canada has about 200 staff, but we have a dedicated tech lab that's designed to be able to kind of get into these systems. It can take them apart and really understand what's happening kind of under the hood of a lot of these AI systems. Then you look at something like the United Kingdom's Information Commissioner's Office, which has well over 1,000 staff. So and well over 1,000 staff and a lot of programs set up for ways that you can kind of have more innovative engagements with regulators around things like regulatory sandboxes and things along those lines. So again, being able to understand amongst regulators who has what capacity within AI is going to be a critical piece. And I think having that shared understanding of who can do what and what the true risks and benefits are going to be is such a critical piece, because I think one of the biggest challenges for me that I'm just kind of seeing from a regulatory perspective is again, from a Western regulatory perspective, I'll say is that there's this narrative that's coming out that AI is such a um, a sine qua non, such an essential piece of future economic prosperity of a nation, or even future security of a nation. That there's this idea that any regulation that that creates restrictions on the development of AI is a threat, as opposed to as opposed to this opportunity, or as opposed to this necessary thing to get to responsible innovation. And so being able to um, have that real understanding of what the potential risks are, what the potential harms are, and realistically what benefits we're trying to achieve, that are not simply just again, making stock prices for a handful of companies go up, or making overall GDP of a country raise.
Vance, I'm so
What?
sorry.
Yeah,
You
cut
have
me off.
30 seconds left, so you
Yeah,
can just
no
do a
problem.
closing remark.
Not a problem. So again, we need to have that ability to counter that narrative. And within countries, or regulators are getting better at having that cooperation amongst various sectors. So we are working towards having better cooperation internationally, and finding those soft mechanisms, finding those ways to have influence over design and development. Again, it's a work in progress, but my overall message is going to be, we just need to reframe regulatory cooperation away from enforcement cooperation and to finding opportunities to influence that design and development. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Vance. Fumsale, thank you so much for joining us. I love to talk to you about power and participation, shifting the lens to inclusion, which is, a very important part of artificial intelligence. So we see that AI governance conversations are often dominated by a handful of powerful perspectives. In your view, whose values are shaping the way AI is being regulated now, and what would it take to ensure that voices of marginalized or underrepresented communities are not just included but also influence decision making?
Thank you. I would just like to start with what I view as the ideal on AI governance. I think previous speakers have kind of highlighted a major challenge in that there's one, a lack of shared language. There's the idea that AI, like all technology, knows no jurisdictional borders. It's global. So what I think the ideal would be is some form of international law around AI governance. And through that process, perhaps run through the UN, there is the ability to get a more kind of more inclusive process that includes the language, the ideals, the ethical systems of various various countries. So I think that is the direction we need to be going. I think the experience from kind of over the last years with social media and the governance around that and the difficulty with different countries, either in some instances not having any laws, regulations or policies in place, and others doing that, is that there's a lack of proper oversight. So I think it's an opportunity to now for international law to be drafted around that. But as it stands right now, outside of what I think is the utopia, my utopia, what I think would be the great thing to have around AI governance, I think there are two challenges of inclusion right now. One is that in the global south, particularly in Africa, there's policy absence. I know in many African countries, AI is just not a consideration. And that's not because, it's just something that's not viewed as important. There is a conflict with bread and butter issues. Most of these are countries that are more concerned or more, they're more focused on those types of issues. So I think because of that, then there is a exclusion in those discussions because, that's just a process that hasn't taken place in those countries. So I think I'd like to see more African countries in the global south, including themselves in those conversations by beginning to begin the process of drafting those policies, crafting those laws. And I always say that it may appear incredibly complex, but I think there is a way of looking at what other jurisdictions have done and kind of amending those laws to reflect local situations. I don't think it's a situation where there needs to be a reinvention of the wheel. And I used to be a lawmaker, and I don't know how to say this in a polite way, that there's a bit of, I don't want to say that tech literacy is not the right phrase, but it's just not something that...
You can be candid. It's okay.
Yeah, it seems like a very difficult topic to handle, and it's just avoided. So I just to kind of encourage that it's not that difficult. There are frameworks in existence that can be amended to fit the requirements in each country. So there's that exclusion. And I think there's the theoretical misnomer around what has been seen as a democratization of AI. And I think that is the wrong phrase to use. There hasn't been a democratization. While there may have been somewhat of a democratization in terms of access to tools, Gen AI tools, particularly like ChatGPT and all of those, there hasn't been a proper democratization. So if we're going to talk democratization and AI governance, and we need to talk about it through the life cycle. So there needs to be democratization. I wrote this down. Not only democratization of AI use, democratization of AI development, so that in the creation of AI tools, there's already diverse voices included in those design choices. In large language models, that there's someone at the table that says you need to look at African languages, you need to look at languages from different countries. There needs to be a democratization of AI profits. It can't be a situation where countries are merely seen as sources of income, and there's no way to kind of share profit. So there needs to be a democratization of AI profits and the democratization of AI governance itself. So the way I kind of summarize it, I think there needs to be a deliberate effort by the global south, by African countries, by other countries, to insert themselves forcefully into the discussion. And that requires them beginning those processes where it hasn't begun. And indeed for there to be a deliberate inviting of those voices to say, come take part in the discussions. And the discussion is not only at the stage where the technology is being deployed from, but through the entire life cycle.
Thank you. Very insightful. I actually have a question, but we're running a bit short on time, so I'm probably gonna leave it towards the end. But I really like the way that you said that the inclusion of gender inclusion or diversity of perspectives is not very difficult to do so, but it just seems very difficult to do so in real world, in making sure that regulations or frameworks actually, include a part of that as well. Thank you so much. Yasmin, we're going to move on to you. We're going to wrap up this round. We've talked a lot about, the challenges, what's not working, but let's imagine what could. If you had a blank slate to design an ideal AI regulatory framework, one that's forward looking, ethically grounded, and innovation friendly, I mean, huge to ask, what are the three most essential features you would include?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Yasmin Aldouri. I'm an AI governance consultant at Deloitte, and I'm the founder of Europe's first youth-led nonprofit focusing on responsible technology. So we're basically trying to bring young voices to the responsible tech field and have them basically share their ideals, their fears, and the ideas on how to make this world a better place. Let's just say it like that. I'm really happy Ms. Van Dam actually brought up the point of international law, because yes, in an ideal world, we would all get along, and in an ideal world, we would have some kind of definition on AI governance, specifically on the international law. But there are two aspects that are really, really I wouldn't say problematic, but that make this utopia hard to achieve. Not, I wouldn't say it's not a possibility to achieve it, but it's hard to achieve it. And that's the first part is definitions. We need to get to a point where everyone defines the same aspects the same way. So just the definition of AI systems is a huge, huge issue. We saw this with the European laws already with the EU AI Act. Then the second part, which is also an issue, is are countries actually upholding international law already? And if we look at the past years, we will see that in a lot of countries, we see a huge increase in countries actually not upholding international law. So the first part would be to actually question and to basically push for more accountability from countries. So this is one aspect. I also wanted to bring up one point because I love the fact that also Ms. Van Dam brought up the aspect of inclusion. We need to set a base, which is infrastructure. If we don't have infrastructure in different countries who are lacking the access to AI, we're not able to democratize the access to AI. So this would also be a base for me. Okay, let's come to the actual question. Ideal frameworks. As I said, in an ideal world, we wouldn't have an approach that is so reactive, as Moritz called it earlier, but we would have one that is adaptive. So in this case, what we have right now is a risk-based approach. So we basically look at AI systems and we categorize them in different risks or straight up just prohibit them. And while I do see why we're doing that, the ideal form would actually be a use case framework. So we actually look at AI systems and we look at them how they're used and in what sectors they're used. The idea behind it is that AI systems, the same AI system can be used in different use cases and in different ways, which means it can have different harms to different stakeholders. And the idea here is to make sure that we can actually use these AI systems, but we make sure that we really do uphold all the different scenarios that could happen. And a use case approach would actually make this easier for us. It would also make it easier to keep in check the impact assessments that you have to do as someone who's actually implementing those laws. That brings me actually to the second part, which is we need frameworks that are actually implementable and understandable. So what exactly do I mean? At the end of the day, those regulations and laws are being implemented by the people who are developing AI systems, because those are the ones who are actually building it, and those are the ones who have to uphold it. So if the developers cannot implement the regulations because they simply do not understand them, we need translators. So people like me or Alex who like go down and like try to explain or be the bridge between tech and law. But if we, in an ideal world, we would have developers who already understand this. We would have developers who would be able to implement each aspect, each principle in a way that is clearly not only defined but understandable. So this is the second part. The third part, and I know that some of you will laugh already because you have heard this so many times over the past days, we need to include all stakeholders, multi-stakeholder approaches. So civil society, private sector, and the public sector need to come together. Now, here's the thing where I disagree with most multi-stakeholder approaches. We talk a lot about including all stakeholders, yet we forget to include the youth. And this is one of the biggest issues I see because in my work within the Responsible Technology Hub, I see not only the potential of youth, but I see that they mostly even understand the technology better and they know how to implement it better. So we need to include them to not only future-proof our legislation, but to make sure that they're included in means of, okay, these are their fears, these are their not only ideas, but these could be possible solutions. And from my work, I can tell you that young people and young professionals have a lot of ideas for solutions that we're facing. They're just not heard. So we need to give them platforms. We need a older generation that leads by example, but also gives platform. We need a young generation that refreshes this discourse every time. And we need spaces that are spaces of real co-creation. So these kind of discussions that we're having right now, they're a great base, but we need spaces where we actually create, where we have enough space to talk, to discuss, but at the same time to bring different disciplines and different sectors together. So what in my work specifically, I see this working actually very well. So having a space where academia comes, where the public sector comes, where the private sector comes, and where we have intergenerational solutions for issues, and we're actually building solutions together. So with that in mind, those would be the three aspects of, I would say, the ideal AI governance framework for me specifically.
Right on time. Thank you so much to all our speakers. So many valuable takeaways. Now we open it up to the floor. The mics are on either side of the room. Please introduce yourself. And if you're joining virtually, feel free to post in the chat or raise your hand. Umair, do we have any questions?
Yes, absolutely. We do have questions. I have received questions in the direct message and the chat box, but do we have any questions from the on-site participants before we move on to the online participants?
We're warming up here. So you, start with the question.
Right. So one of the questions that I received is, and I think it might be for Moritz to maybe answer this better. The question is that just like the concept of internet fragmentation, do you see that we are heading towards an era of AI fragmentation due to absence of consensus-based definition, absence of shared language? And if that is the case, how do you suggest to move forward with it?
Yes, I do think that we do see fragmentation, but I also think that it's maybe a little bit reductive. I think this often gets portrayed as a fragmentation alongside country lines or jurisdictions, like EU, US, China, whereas there are often splits between different factions and their interests, and what they see as the ideal governance system. And all of these factions have input. And so I see a fragmentation happening on multiple levels. So it goes beyond different countries and or jurisdictions. I'm fairly concerned about fragmentation because, as I said, it creates the wrong incentives to race to the bottom. It doesn't build a great base for trust between different partners. Again, different countries, but also different sectors. The nonprofit sector, industry, academia, government. So yes, I see this as a concern. In terms of what can be done, I think it goes back to identifying the areas where people already agree on, and then building up from there. There's never going to be perfect agreement and total unison on these things, but I think sometimes there's more room and more overlap than people are willing to give credit for. So in the foreign policy or diplomatic domain, track 1.5, track 2 dialogues have been pretty successful, I think, in identifying these areas of consensus. And yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it's also events and fora like IGF, where people get together and hopefully get to at some point establish a shared language, or at least hear what other people. I think sometimes people are also too ambitious here, right? They want they want everybody to speak the same language. And cultural anthropologists and other people will tell us that that is not actually what we should be aiming for, right? It is okay for people to speak different languages. But I think if you dial back your ambition and say, no, we don't have to have a complete agreement, the first step is hearing how the other side sees things. Then I think having more of these conferences and as other people have said, diverse representation of voices at these conferences and events can be very useful in charting a path forward towards a shared language. It's an iterative, it's a painful process. It's not going to come overnight, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't invest energy in it.
All right. So there is another question here, and it says that. Right. So, can any of the speakers point towards any exemplary AI policy that balances innovation and ethics? I understand this is quite a broad-ended question, but if anyone would like to take that up.
Anyone from the on-site speakers would like to take this question? Perfect.
Let me take this off first. So, can I point any regulation out there that brings in good governance and doesn't hinder innovation? The funny part is that officially there is not a lot of governance out there yet. So officially laws that are implemented. There's a lot of discussion out. The US is working on specific governance structures within their states, and then they're trying to do this federally as well. We have Canada as well. We have the EU who brought up the EU AI Act, which is also being discussed again, by the way, for those who haven't kept up with the news lately. So even there, we have still discussions on how to implement specific laws, and there is still a lot of room. So, for example, with the Middle East, we barely have any official AI governance there. We see a trend of discussions. We saw this at the last IGF, where a lot of Middle Eastern and North African states came together and started having a discussion, but this discussion relied more on principles rather than on actual frameworks that could be implemented. So there's still, for whoever who asked this question, there's still a lot of room to actually co-create and to bring regulation into the market.
Great. Harsa, I believe you got a question from the chat as well. Do you want to go?
Yeah, we have another question. So Ahmed Khan asked if there has been a recent trend of wariness and pushback from tech companies against what they call excessive regulation, which restricts innovation and goes against development. So, is there a way forward with harmony, or are we going to see a similar friction in the AI space as we have seen in social media and tech space versus government regulations?
Anyone from the on-site speakers want to take this ahead or have a comment to make on this? going to go online as well. Moritz or Vance, do you want to answer this question? Harisa, can you please repeat the question again, though? We didn't understand it quite
Yeah,
well because
yeah,
the connection got a bit
yeah,
fuzzy.
sure. So the question is that I'll cut it short. Is there a way forward with Harmony, or are we going to see a similar friction in the AI space as we have seen in social media and tech spaces versus government regulations?
What I understand is that in the past, we've seen that there has been some friction between platform regulation or platform governance as well. Are we going to be seeing a similar sort of friction in AI framework, AI regulation as well as we move forward in the future? Do you think so? You don't think so? Just a one-word answer would be great as well.
Let me answer that one. I hope not. That's why we're here having this multi-stakeholder discussion so we can achieve some kind of consensus. And also complementing the last question about different kinds of legislations and which one would provide safeguards and would not hinder innovation. I believe that the UK has been taking a good approach by not regulating with a specific bill of law. There is no bill of law going on right now. They are letting the sectoral authorities handle the issues, and also they did not define the concepts, so it won't be a closed concept. So it can let the technology evolve, and we can evolve concepts as well. So I hope that I believe that a principle-based approach and not a strict regulation would be the best approach, and that would prevent the friction we're talking about.
Okay, great. Perfectly concise answer. And good thing too, because we're running a bit short on time. So we're going to move towards the final stretch. I'd like to hear one last thought from each speaker. Please, restrict your answer to one sentence or two sentences at max. Yasmin, we're going to start with you. What is the most urgent action we must take today to align AI governance with ethical foresight?
To give a quick answer to the last question about the friction between tech companies and regulators, yes, we see the friction. Yes, there will be more friction, and I would be surprised if we didn't have it, if specifically in democratic states specifically live from this friction. So we will see it, and hopefully we will find a common ground to discuss these regulations. But what I do think is critical and what we need specifically as a society, regardless of government regulation or tech regulation or whatnot, we need to make sure that we're critically assessing what we're consuming. And we need to make sure that we critically assess what we say, what we perceive, and what we create, because what we're seeing right now is very worrisome in means of how we're using specific AI systems without questioning their outputs. We're publicizing them without questioning whether the contexts are right or not. So I believe one of the most important things right now as citizens is to make sure that we're bringing critical thinking back again.
Fumzile, would you want to go next?
Yeah, I'm going to restrict it to one sentence. I've already gone into two. Binding international law on platform governance, AI platform governance.
Perfect. Alexandra, would you want to go next?
I would like to leave you with a key action point that we must move from ethical intention to institutional implementation. I think ethical foresight cannot remain a theoretical aspiration or a paragraph in a regulation or a corporate statement. We need to build core structures of governance within companies and organizations in general.
Rightly so. Ethical foresight should not be just a corporate statement. Thank you so much, Alexandra. And we're going to go online to our online speakers. Vance, if you want to go ahead with the, 2 or 3 sentences to this question: what is the most urgent action we must take today to align AI governance with ethical foresight?
I'd say it's to shift the narrative around AI away from AI being either an inevitability or a wholly necessary piece of future economies, to think about what outcomes we want from future societies and how AI can build into those, can factor into those.
Perfect. Moritz, if you want to go next.
Yeah, I'm going to just add to that, more generally speaking, adding nuance to the dialogue. So overcoming the simple dichotomies of it's innovation versus regulation. You can have innovation through regulation. We've had that for decades. Overcoming the US versus China or the human rights-based versus risk-based approach. Breaking away with these dichotomies that are not helpful and that ignore a lot of the nuance that is embedded within these debates.
Moritz, I'm going to ask you to elaborate more because this is such an interesting point to make and adds so much value to the discussion. If you can elaborate more, I think we might give you 1 more minute.
Yeah, maybe I'll touch on the. There's much in here, but maybe the one thing that also touches on a question that was raised in the chat is on balancing ethics and innovation, or regulation and innovation. And again, this is often pitted as a you can choose. You can either regulate or you can innovate. And the EU is at a crossroads, and we can't fall behind. And we got to innovate. Whereas the reality on the ground is that safe and trustworthy frameworks that give companies also predictability about the future and safety, and know that their customers will like and feel that their products are safe, is integral to innovation. And we've seen this in the past. The nuclear industry, the aviation industry, they took off after we had safety standards in place, because that made it possible then to scale operations. And so I think this is just a very fascinating example for those of you interested. I've previously done work on this, writing up case studies on different safety standards in other industries, and how they contribute to the development of a technology. So going against the we have to choose. The UK is an example of a very pro-innovative regulatory approach, and they didn't step back and say we're not going to regulate. They were thinking about how regulation can serve innovation, and I think there are many ways that we can do this, and this often, unfortunately, gets ignored because it is easier to craft a narrative that pits two things, and often two people and two camps against each other.
Thank you so much. And what I take away from this is that building safe and trustworthy frameworks is definitely key. Thank you again to all our speakers for the depth and thoughtfulness you have brought to the conversation. I have learned a lot, and I'm sure my colleagues, my online moderators have also, and the audience also have learned a lot. I've learned many new concepts. Thank you to these brilliant speakers. I also want to thank our audience, both here and online, for their presence and for the conversation as well. Your presence on the final day of IGF 2025 is, very important to us. And thank you to the wonderful IGF media team for coordinating the technical aspects. Before we close, I'd love to invite everyone on for a picture. First, we're going to have a picture with the speakers, and then I'm going to invite the audience if they can come on the stage and have a picture with the speakers and myself. Thank you very much.